Now we're going to discuss the factors, the background conditions that led to the first Great Migration. And as noted in the slide, this is when you see 1.6 million African Americans migrate out of the South towards the industrial centers of the North or the Midwest, like Chicago, like New York City. You'll see them form African American neighborhoods like Southside Chicago, Harlem, and so forth. And we have to discuss, first of all, why these conditions arose in the first place. Well, here we need to discuss push and pull factors that explain human migration. So here's the conceptual distinction between push factors and pull factors whenever you discuss any sort of human migration. What does a push factor refer to? Well, push factors refers to those factors that are specifically located in the migrant's home country or home region. So, again, those are the factors that shape migration, that influence migration, specifically located in the migrant's home region, and perhaps if you're talking about international travel, home country, right? And that's opposed to pull factors. Pull factors are those factors that shape migration that are specifically located in the migrant's new home country or home region, right? So one is based on place of origin, that's push factors. And one is based on the place of new settlement, which is pull factors. Okay, so you have to make that conceptual distinction whenever you discuss human migration, but certainly as applied to here, our topic, Great Migration. So let's first discuss pull factors. And those, of course, are those factors located in the North, in the areas that African Americans would settle in, the industrial centers. Now, one thing that was happening in the North is due to World War I, you see immigration of European labor. The federal government passed something called the 1917 Immigration Restriction Act, which greatly curtailed the flow of European labor, which was dependent upon to man the factories. You may have heard of this time in our immigration history, whereby after the Civil War, between 1870 and let's say this time, 1914, you see about 12 million, mostly Southern and Eastern Europeans, like Italians, Greeks, Russians, Jews, Ukrainians, coming over to the United States. They go through Ellis Island, right? They see the Statue of Liberty, they get processed, and then they go to their destination, right? In their ethnic neighborhoods. Okay, now that was the source of the labor during our Industrial Revolution that occurred after the Civil War, during the 1870s and moving forward. But all of a sudden, there's a curtailment to that immigration labor because of World War I. And, that involves different European empires. We wanted to put a stop, or not a complete halt, but to curtail it drastically, the halt of these Europeans coming over. Now, of course, Northern industry still needs its cheap labor because those workers were a source of dependable cheap labor, meaning that they're paid less than, the average American worker. So they looked to the South and specifically to African Americans to replenish their scarcity of labor. All right. So there's a direct connection with World War I and the 1917 Immigration Restriction Act and the first Great Migration, because African Americans were seen as replacement laborers since there's no more European migrant labor that they could depend on. Okay, so that's the great pull fact here. The labor shortage in Northern industry due to the scarcity of European labor with the 1917 Immigration Act. Now, in the South, what is happening there that could quote unquote, push them out of the South? What are the push factors, in other words? Well, we know that there's racial violence happening in the South. We know that there's the Klan and lynchings in the South. So African Americans began to search for better racial tolerance in the North. They assumed that the conditions that they faced in the South, widespread oppression and even racial violence, would not be on the same scale as in the North as it would be in their place of origin. And moreover, the Southern agricultural system, namely the cotton industry, began to suffer greatly during this time, largely because of a natural disaster. You had this boll weevil infestation that ruined cotton fields and led to the thousands of displaced black farmers, right? They no longer had fields to work in because of this agricultural devastation. Okay, so this happened to coincide with World War I and the availability of industrial jobs in the North due to labor shortage, as I explained. Okay, so this leads to, again, 1.6 million African Americans, these workers plus their families migrating north and forming these areas in northern cities like Southside Chicago and so forth. And it's important to note this, that historians argue that ultimately the Great Migrations, both World War I and World War II, were not simply economic acts. That is to say, they're migrating solely due to industrial jobs. Rather, they were also political acts as well, not just economic. That is to say, eventually what you see happening is a change in the demographics of northern cities because of the influx of African American migrants. And of course, because they're moving north, now African Americans, their voting freedoms are now restored, right? So ultimately, this gave African Americans new voting power, and therefore it shifted the political landscapes of many of these northern cities. And eventually, it helped the Democratic Party because, by the time FDR becomes the president in not the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the Democratic Party will change its political agenda. It'll no longer be the party of Southern segregation, and it will shift towards the party of the working class. Okay, and African Americans would be crucial in that regard. So the first Great Migration becomes a reality. It's now underway. And you see the migrants finding themselves in northern industrial and urban areas, so different from the rural South, with no factories there. But also, one thing about these northern cities is there's very few blacks that live there. So the question is, where will they settle, right? Now, first of all, the arrival of large numbers of poor Southern blacks, because let's remember, they're coming from sharecropping backgrounds, most of them. When they arrived to these cities, this would alarm your average middle-class white, because they were perceived as poor, uncouth, unkempt, just out of sharecropping. And not only that, it would alarm the working class. That is to say, immigrants, right? Because they perceive African Americans as this new economic competition. So you see African Americans settle in cities like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. And as they began to settle, you see the increase in racial tension. And it became the case that evidently the North was no more tolerant in African American presence than the South. So this would lead to increasing racial animosity. And at the same time, after World War I, you're going to see African American soldiers that serve in that war in Europe. They're going to notice that places like Paris, France, tolerates African Americans, treats them as equals. Then they return to the United States, where again they're relegated to second-class citizenship. So black soldiers returning from service overseas became more militant and less willing to take those old patterns of discrimination, and they're willing to fight back. So in these northern cities during the Great Migrations, you see race riots just erupt. In fact, in the month of July 1919, just 1 year after the end of World War I, there were race riots in 20 cities and towns in that just single month, right? 20 race riots. The worst one was in Chicago, the Chicago race riot, where it started because in the public swimming area of the city, it was segregated according to race, and one black child happened to accidentally swim over to the white area, and he was pelted with rocks. Of course, African Americans began to fight back against that. And before you know it, this racial violence just swept through the city, and it's noted here in this newspaper, Riot Sweep Chicago. And here's one that shows a race riot in South Philadelphia. And as this depiction shows, you see buildings on fire. So these were significant race riots. Now, it's important to note here is you see segregation basically eventuating in these northern cities. But let's recall our distinction between de facto segregation and de jure segregation. In the South, if you recall, well, that system of segregation is de jure. That is, it's mandated by law. Now, if you think about the northern cities, there are no laws mandating racial segregation, but there is de facto segregation, and that is, what's done customarily. So, de jure is statutory segregation, right? And in the north, de facto, it's customary segregation, done by custom.